talking? Wonderful. Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
Thank you for being here. Really appreciate it. Tonight's lecture has a better name. I just called it, for simplicity, America's Missing History. Kind of the double entendre, what is missing, and then that we're also missing it. But this came out of a conversation. One of the greatest parts about Proud is we don't stick to topics well. So when we're having our meetings, we go off on and start talking about a series that you participated in, evidently, of the lectures that were given on Black history. And it was multiple sessions. Now, Ms. Laverne's son, John Pierre Mitchum, was also part of that. So that sparked our idea of holding tonight's session. So anyhow, really appreciate you here. Our guest tonight is Dr. Geoff Ward, who is a professor of African American Studies and a faculty affiliate in the Department of Sociology and American Culture Studies at Washington University. He is director of the WashU and Slavery Project, a university initiative based in the Center for the Study of Race, Ethnicity, and Equity. And his work examines the history and legacy of racialized violence and means for repairing the harms of that violence. In addition to numerous research articles and essays, he's the author of the Black Child Savers, Racial Democracy and Juvenile Justice, an award-winning book on the contested history and haunting remnants of Jim Crow juvenile justice. A lot of other things here, he's a member of the National Monument Audit, and is a member of the Mayor's Commemorative Landscape Task Force in Clayton, Missouri, and he serves the Reparative Justice Coalition of St. Louis, a network of volunteers working with Equal Justice Initiative to address legacies of racist violence in the region. So, unless there's other things, there's a whole lot of things on here, but
that was more than enough.
Start.
More than enough. Thank you.
But thank you for being here.
Thank you for inviting me and be here with you all. I've been in St. Louis now for about 6 years. I moved here with my family from Southern California, and to join the faculty at WashU. I was teaching in University of California for about 10 years before that, and Boston for years before that. But I came here in part because I realized that this would be a meaningful place to pursue the work that I'm interested in, the work I've been doing for going on 2 decades now, looking at how histories of racialized violence shape subsequent patterns of conflict and violence and inequality. Of course, I knew about St. Louis most recently through by following the events following the killing of Mike Brown, and so I knew this was a community where the greater St. Louis, where there was some energy around some of these questions and an opportunity to engage them in a way that's not always the case. The issues I'll talk about tonight are issues everywhere in the world, including where I'm from, Los Angeles, California. But in many places, the past is so buried that it is very difficult to get people to engage meaningfully in its presence. So that's a little bit why I came here. And I was driving over here tonight, and I realized, actually, I think I probably thought about this when we first started talking about this, but this is my first time actually coming to Ferguson. And no particular reason. I didn't avoid coming to Ferguson, but I also didn't want to come and do a drive-by, looky-loo sort of thing either. So I really just want to say that I'm really appreciative of the invitation to join you tonight and share with you. So, I can get there.
that thing back
Can't get
So,
up.
which basically means that I'm interested in understanding how history works as a social force, how the past remains present and also relates to the future. I'm not a historian, so you're probably familiar with historical, kind of traditional historical work where historiography is sort of about explaining exactly what happened using the best sources we have available. In the past, what I do in my work more so is understand how histories shape contemporary social dynamics and relations and their implications for our collective future. And I really started doing this work. I started thinking about history as a sociologist when I was writing the book that Ellen mentioned, The Black Child Savers, which is about the rise and the fall and the lasting haunting remnants of the Jim Crow juvenile justice system. And the name of the book, The Black Child Savers, the book is referencing the generations of black women who mobilized to dismantle the Jim Crow juvenile justice system. I'll just give you a little bit of context on that system. Historically, there was a movement to protect children and youth from the harsh punishments of the adult criminal legal system by recognizing that by virtue of their status as children, they both had diminished criminal culpability and they had greater potential for malleability into decent human beings, the decent human beings a society would want to be filled with, relative to adults who were considered to be both more criminally responsible and also less amenable to rehabilitation than children. Probably not surprising to you, that idea, also important caveat, an important piece of this was the idea that the juvenile justice system, like the common school system, could prepare the enlightened citizenry that our participatory democracy required. This early system was described as an incubator of citizens. Now, so too were our schools. The Republican idea of, not Republican in terms of partisan politics, but the school as a vital institution in a republic recognized education, high quality, common education as an essential part of self-government, so that the citizenry would be prepared to participate in self-government. Those ideas, both in the educational context and the criminal legal context and the juvenile justice context, were profoundly distorted by the politics of race, where white supremacist ideology contended that non-white children were a different species of human, first of all, less than fully human, less capable of moral and intellectual development than their white counterparts, and also maintained that America was a white democracy, that the citizens who mattered, who needed to be developed, were white citizens. So that idea, the Republican schoolhouse, this enlightened approach to juvenile justice, was derailed by the racial politics of our society and resulted in the development of things like Jim Crow educational systems and Jim Crow juvenile justice systems, and museums and libraries and public parks. I just bought a book about state parks, Jim Crow state parks. I mean, it's fascinating, just all the ways this is translated in our history. The Black Child Savers were these generations of black women who began in the 1890s to combat this system. The first juvenile court was established in 1898. It wasn't until around 1910 that there were juvenile courts in every state. And I'm sorry, 1920. But as these systems developed, they reserved their resources and they reserved their liberal democratic principles, ethos, for white children, and potentially white children. Those were European immigrant youth who were deemed inferior to the Anglo-Saxon Protestants who were dominant in the society, but who were considered salvageable by virtue of their European ancestry. And so they were priorities, particularly girls in these early systems. But black women and men and others realized that this was that this system, as an educational context, that this juvenile justice system was collectively threatening. They realized when they would see, they would see chain gangs that included adults and who are disproportionately African American. Now, in this period of time, 90% of African Americans live in the South. So this is before the Great Migration increases black populations in the urban Midwest and North and East and so forth. And they would see chain gangs with people in prison stripes, including black children, smoking cigarettes and exposed to the harsh realities of these really brutal penal regimes of the late 19th century and the early 20th century. And they realized that withholding from black children the same opportunities for self-realization, for development, would cast into the future kind of collective black economic and political and social disadvantage. They refer to this system as a genocidal institution that wasn't literally killing black children, though that happened also through state executions as well as lynchings. But they meant that figuratively to describe how the life chances of black children were being diminished, and therefore their future prospects as adults, and therefore black community collective prospects were being diminished in terms of things like economic mobility, political participation, social well-being, and so forth. So this is what motivated the Black Child Savers to really intervene in racialized violence that was projecting into the future a kind of collective disadvantage. So as a sociologist, this really fascinated me because I hadn't really thought that much about how racialized violence travels over time. We think of it as, say, the killing of Mike Brown as a moment. And maybe there's we think about the immediate aftermath, but we don't really have as much language to make sense of what that moment means right now or next week. That's the kind of sociological question about the legacy that I've been really interested in my work. So after I finished doing this work on the racial history of juvenile justice, and I spent a long time writing that book because it was a sweeping study of not only half of it's about the Jim Crow juvenile justice system, the other half is about the movement to dismantle it. But as I was finishing that project, I thought, well, what else? What are some other ways that histories of racialized violence travel through time? And soon after that, I learned about this, what was at the time a small body of research on the legacy of lynching. And essentially what this work has shown, and since then, this was about, my book, The Black Child Savers, came out in 2012. This was probably a decade or so ago. I really started, maybe 15 years ago, I really started looking closely at this work on the legacy of lynching, and it's grown substantially since then, including through some of the studies me and my colleagues have contributed. But what it essentially shows is that in places with more pronounced histories of racial terror lynching, you have elevated rates of conflict and violence and inequality still today. This has been shown for a host of outcomes, and all of these studies are pretty sophisticated multivariate analyses. So they're not saying simply like if there was a lynching in a place, it's likely that there's also some other bad things. It's saying that where there were lynchings, and where we also take account of other factors that might explain other outcomes, like I'll give you a specific example. One of the most consistently demonstrated one that's relevant to our region is contemporary homicide rates. These studies have shown over and over again that where there are pronounced histories of lynching historically, lynching generally peaked in the early, first third of the 20th century, and essentially ended as it's been formally defined. I mean, many people argue that lynching evolved, didn't end per se, but lynchings, as defined by the NAACP and Tuskegee, generally are declined dramatically by the 1940s. In communities where there are documented histories of lynching, the rate of homicide generally, and specifically Black victim homicide, is significantly greater, net of other factors that relate to homicide, like poverty rates and population density and educational attainment and other kinds of factors that are known to predict homicide. Taking all of that into account, these studies have shown the history of lynching is still a significant predictor of where homicides are likely to happen today. This has been shown for similar story for infant mortality rates, for white supremacist mobilization today, white conservatism generally, white political behavior that is in support of conservative candidates for political office, more pronounced in communities distinguished by histories of lynching, the presence of Confederate monuments, the suppression of African American voting rights, incarceration rates, rates of capital punishment. The list goes on and on and on. Our most recent study looked at corporal punishment in public schools as relates to histories of lynching. And we found that that every additional lynching in the history of a county increases the odds that any child will be corporally punished, but significantly, but even more so for African American children. The per lynching in the history of the county, the odds that a Black child will be corporally punished in these 11 states we studied went up by 6% per lynching. So in a county with 10 lynchings, an African American child in a school in that county is 60% more likely to experience corporal punishment, violent school discipline, than a similarly situated African American child in a county in one of those states without a history of lynching. The effect for white children was 4% per lynching. Now, in that study, again, we control for all these other factors, like how religiously conservative the community is, because we know that religious conservatism is related to support for corporal punishment. We have data on how experienced teachers are, the racial makeup of the school, whether it's an urban or rural school, a host of factors. And taking all that into account, the history of lynching remained a significant predictor of whether children would experience violence in violent discipline in their schools. Now, one of the limitations of this work is that it doesn't explain well the mechanisms. We don't have good data that allows us to explain why lynching predicts homicide or infant mortality or corporal punishment or any of these other things. We have some ideas about that, and I'll give you some examples, but it's difficult to capture exactly why this is why these relationships endure and the mechanisms that explain them. We think that in the case of homicide, there are a number of things at work, and really this relates to both of these contexts in some ways, these examples of homicide and corporal punishment. One of the things is one of the issues is how histories of lynching relate to the brutalization, what's been called the brutalization of the culture. We have been desensitized, more so in some places than others, to violence over generations. It is um, essentially normalized in some communities, has been normalized, not only by the perpetration of lynching, and by the way, histories of enslavement predict lynching. There's a whole chain here. Lynching rates are higher in counties with more pronounced histories of enslavement. So in these communities where over generations there has been a kind of normalization of racialized violence, we think that pattern persists in other forms of racialized violence. And key here is that it's not just that there were violent incidents in those places, it's that the violence was perpetrated with impunity. So this goes to, which is part of the normalization of the violence. But another factor we think is at work in the case of homicide, also relevant to corporal punishment, is what's called, related to this impunity, is what's called, been described as legal estrangement. So on one hand, you have cultures that have been brutalized. You also have communities where people are distrustful of the state, including the legal institutions, to fairly adjudicate their grievances. The state is implicated in this history of racist violence, both in the perpetration of violence, but also in the withholding of prevention and redress in the aftermath of incidents like lynching and long histories of police violence and so forth. So there's a particularly for African American communities in the U.S. context, there is an estrangement from the state and its apparatus, which in the context of homicide is believed to contribute to what's been described as a kind of self-help orientation. If you have a conflict, rather than call the police, resolve the conflict yourself. The police and the courts won't provide remedy. Now, in a society with easy access to lethal weapons, that orientation easily translates into high rates of lethal violence. So we think that's part of what's going on with the history of lynching related to contemporary homicide. And by the way, there have been some studies that have looked at how, a couple of studies have looked at what happens in the intermediate period between the decline of lynching and contemporary homicide. And they find that it matters. They find, for example, that in places where white voters did not support candidates who ran on white supremacist platforms in the 1950s and 60s, I'm thinking of, forgetting the exact years of their campaigns, but I'm thinking of George Wallace and Strom Thurmond. So in counties with histories of lynching, where white voters opposed those candidates, the predictive power of lynching related to homicide later was diminished. Similarly, in another study we looked at how civil rights movement era violence might relate to the potency of the history of lynching as relates to contemporary homicide. And we found that in communities where there is also documented anti-civil rights violence, bombings of churches, beatings of activists, assassinations, and so forth, that the power of lynching in predicting homicide remains stronger than in places where there aren't these documented histories of anti-civil rights violence. So the picture I'm trying to paint for you is one where we have essentially a soil that is more or less conducive to the reproduction over time of racialized violence. But also, I think I'm meaning to stress there is some hopeful indications that we're not powerless with regards to that soil, that we can uproot some of the harmful legacies of historical racial violence through intentional actions like you all are engaged with and many other communities are engaged with, that might interrupt the legacy of historical racial violence. Let me just say a couple more things, and then I'll stop because I just keep going. Uh, but let me just mention a couple of other things. One is I want to talk a little bit, since I'm here with you tonight, I direct the Wash U in Slavery Project. I want to tell you a little bit about that because it is something happening in our community that is related, I think, to this. What I'm going to end on, which is this idea of reparative memory work or anti-racist memory work that has the potential to be, I think, disruptive of the repetition. So the Wash U in Slavery Project is part of this global consortium, is an initiative through this global consortium called Universities Studying Slavery, where today there are around 100 institutions around the world, mostly in the United States. I just got back for last week. Or 2 weeks ago, I was in Halifax, Nova Scotia, where 2 universities there are part of Universities Studying Slavery, are examining the Afro-Canadian history, and including how those institutions, those universities are implicated in the history of slavery in Canada. But these are mostly university-based, mostly US-based universities that commit to examining how the history of the institution, the university, is entangled with the history of and legacy of slavery, and they commit to addressing those entanglements. In theory, now, we'll see about the latter part. But we're early in this project. We've been at it now for a couple of years. Amidst everything else, I didn't stop everything to work on this. This is in addition to teaching classes and my own research and everything else. But I'm working with students and other faculty and staff at Wash U to just begin to re-examine our story. Some of you may know Wash U used to like to tell a story about its abolitionist foundations, that William Greenleaf Eliot was an abolitionist. Not quite true, we've learned. He was, at best, a moderate opponent to the institution of slavery. He was very much invested in the idea of white supremacy and that white Americans should remain dominant, though he did oppose, at some point, come to oppose the institution of slavery. We haven't talked as much about our co-founder with William Greenleaf Eliot, who was a man named Wayman Crowe, who was an enslaver himself. And like many of Wash U's founding trustees, early chancellors, other officials, a defender of the institution of slavery and white supremacy in other ways. One of the key figures we've been interested in this work so far is John O'Fallon, who's also not often discussed as a founding a founder of Wash U. John O'Fallon's name is everywhere. I'm seeing, I go through, my kids play soccer. I'm always going to O'Fallon to play soccer, for their games. O'Fallon, Missouri, O'Fallon, Illinois. John O'Fallon and his brother Benjamin were, John in particular was perhaps the largest enslaver in Missouri in terms of the number of people enslaved at the time of the founding of Wash U in 1853. John O'Fallon was also, would go on to become president, was president in 1846 of the Anti-Abolition Society of St. Louis. Cities across the country, particularly in the Midwest and border South states, formed anti-abolition societies as the abolitionist movement grew in an attempt to ward off the threat of abolition. John O'Fallon was the president of the society here in St. Louis. And its primary achievement, as far as we can tell, was to successfully lobby for state legislation that prohibited the education of free and enslaved African Americans throughout Missouri. That legislation passed in 1846, 1847. The legacies of that legislation are with us still today in terms of unequal access to high quality education and unwillingness to invest public money in the education of African American children. But just 7 years later, O'Fallon was a primary benefactor of WashU, an establishment of Washington of Washington University. And we found so far that about 50% of the early officials of the university and separately 50% of the early officials of the WashU Medical School were entangled in some way with the institution of slavery. And the entanglements are complicated. Some of them were clearly enslavers who owned enslaved people for the purposes of exploiting them. Others were at least at some point involved in efforts to free African Americans, in part through ownership, so buying so as to enslave people so as to remove the claim of another enslaver and affect their manumission. But the details are still unclear, and there are people who are in both of those categories, who made a deal to buy an enslaved person, promising them they would free them, and not freeing them for several years, and then eventually doing so. So we're still really unpacking, untangling this really complicated story. Slavery in St. Louis was much more complicated than a place like Charlottesville, Virginia, or Oxford, Mississippi, or one of these other places where universities are studying slavery. In part because in an urban and slavery in urban contexts was tend to involve relatively smaller scale slave ownership, and also these systems like leasing enslaved people. Many, when I was talking to Jean Pierre invited me to speak at St. Louis Priory School. Afterward, the student, I was telling her that I'd never been in a space that was all white and male before. It was a little scary, even though they were like high school kids. I wasn't like so scared, but I was like, this is really weird. But afterward, one of them said to me, we had Q&A. He said, why are you trying to make me ashamed of my grandmother? She didn't own slaves. Which, I should have told him that it's a good thing she didn't own slaves because it was illegal when his grandmother was alive. But, I just explained to him that he hadn't been paying attention. Because I wasn't talking about his grandmother. And in fact, I wasn't. The point I was really emphasizing there was that we collectively inherit structurally the legacy of slavery. What our direct genealogical connection to it, to slavery, is in relation to the perpetration or victimization of slavery, is important, but it's not the whole story. If you arrive here tonight at Lambert Airport from some other place in the world and call this place your home, you will inherit the legacy of slavery. You will, that historical debris will be part of your life here in St. Louis. It's part of my life, though I'm not from St. Louis. It's my genealogical ties to slavery are through my African-American father from South Carolina, my biological father, my adoptive mother from North Carolina, African-American mother, and all kinds of other complications. But he said, but this was this kind of stock response to inviting people to think about hard histories and difficult truths, and why are you making me feel bad? So we're learning a lot through Washington slavery. One of the reasons we're doing that work is to prepare so that more of our students, our staff, our faculty of the university, and our community partners have opportunities to engage these difficult questions. And not that everyone's gonna sort of have, become a leader around this or have all the answers. Anyone's gonna have all the answers. But we need to find ways to become more comfortable as people in our communities who can talk about these difficult issues and not freak out. Not feel like it's an existential crisis, or I'm insulting your great grandmother because I'm acknowledging the reality that slavery as an institution operated here in St. Louis and affects our lives. So we're hopeful that, typically, as you know, the handful of students who pass through WashU and take a class with me would be the ones who kind of learn about this, or one of the handful of other classes would learn about this. But we're using things like exhibitions on our website and programming and immersive learning, traveling to different places, learning about how these histories are played out and how folks are approaching reckoning with them, so that more of our students come out of their education equipped emotionally as well as intellectually to sit with these kinds of questions that will inevitably present themselves wherever they go next. The last thing I want to talk about, I'm happy to come back to any of this, but I want to just end with this idea, this point about reparative memory work. We know from a lot of research that that intergenerational trauma or historical trauma that I'm describing, that we have to find ways to process that trauma, and rather than try to seal it off, bury it, as if it didn't happen or as if it doesn't matter. This is why I started with how we know it matters. Some of the ways we know it matters. But rather than seal it off, how do we integrate this historical trauma in healthier ways, in ways that give us more strength and capacity as a society, that are healing, rather than treat it in ways, deal with it in ways that maintain the divisions, the harm of the history itself. And we're seeing this play out right before our eyes right now. We have in our government, we have in some of our school boards, some of our community organized, parent organizations and so forth, these efforts to seal off the difficult truths, the uncomfortable past, and this intent to maintain the motivated ignorance of young people, like that young person I mentioned at the St. Louis Priory School. There's a desire among some elements of our society to ensure that he continues to not understand this history. So that he doesn't start to ask different kinds of questions. There's a fear of what different kinds of questions and how his own identity might shift in relation to exposure, I think, to these kinds of questions. But we know from a lot of contexts, including the context of Holocaust studies, Holocaust remembrance, that we have to find ways to process the trauma. And I think it's clear from that context also that it's incomplete, that we don't have all the answers. I do think there is some, I mentioned this work demonstrating that in communities where there is an interruption in the transmission of the historical trauma, vis-a-vis not re-upping with racist political candidates. That's a disruption of the cycle of racialized violence. In places where civil rights movement protesters were not bombed and burned and attacked and so forth. That's a disruption of the cycle. I'm really curious as a sociologist, a historical sociologist, thinking about society as a social body. What are the other ways we can disrupt this cycle to create a healthier social body? And I'm increasingly thinking about this as a question about how we can metabolize the past. So you think about metabolism, how the body metabolizes organisms and uses them for energy, right? and when we fail to metabolize, the body suffers. It's so how do we, in relation to this difficult past, the history of of community violence, the history of state violence, how do we process this as a social body in a way that gives us more strength, more resiliency? I think my working theory, and this is really a theory, this is a theory that kind of motivated me to move here and to sort of work with communities, why I work with the mayor's task force in Clayton, and why I pushed our chancellor to join universities studying slavery, and I work with the Equal Justice Initiative in St. Louis, because I have this working theory that if we develop a more honest, inclusive, and healthy relationship to the past, this will translate into a healthier social body. One where we see division, resentment, distrust give way to greater mutual respect and cooperation and empathy, and sort of seeing each other's interests as our own. I think we can use our past, we can use a shared understanding of the past as a way to build greater capacity for collective well-being. Now, this is a theory, and I'll just stop here. But this is a theory, and I could say more about why I think it might be true. But ultimately, it's an empirical question. We need documentation about what we're doing, how this is manifesting, and so that at some point in the future, someone, hopefully not me, but someone can answer the question: what did it all add up to? What did all of the, recontextualization and removal and replacement of monuments and street names and apologies and acknowledgments and so forth, what did all that add up to? Did it reduce infant mortality rates in communities that engaged in that truth-telling? Did it translate into greater equity in terms of educational attainment or political participation and representation and so forth? These are the sociological kinds of questions that I'm hoping we'll be able to answer. So thank you for listening to me. So I'm happy to talk more about any of that or anything you want to talk about.
You go ahead, Dr. J. Done any work in East St. Louis?
Yes.
Because I've worked with Catherine Dunham before, which in a way to me was she was trying to do that transition, but she was doing it through African and Haitian culture. And I was just thinking about it because that's where they had the riots, right? They didn't have the riots over here. Over here it was more subtle racism. People still got killed, but over there it was just crazy racism.
Yeah. Now I'm really, like when I moved here, I was like, I came here to do this work, and then I wanted to base my academic practice here. And people would say to me, "Oh, you came to the right place because St. Louis is really, I didn't really specifically mean St. Louis. I meant the Mississippi Valley. I was thinking about places like Little Dixie in Missouri and on the Missouri River and East St. Louis and the lower Mississippi Valley, which I'm bringing this up now because so much of the African American community of East St. Louis and of St. Louis originates most recently, it migrated from the lower Mississippi Valley. These were, I think, St. Louis is Greater St. Louis, which using to include East St. Louis, is an amazing refugee city. Not only populated by more recently displaced populations from places like Afghanistan and Ukraine and Bosnia in particular, but also various African nations, but a substantial population of internally displaced African Americans and their descendants who were forced migrants and survival migrants who came to St. Louis. In many cases, also, fleeing pogroms in other places before East St. Louis. And, racist violence in places like West Plains, Missouri, 1904 attempts to banish its entire black population. This is a small town, central Missouri. Memphis.
Sundown town.
Yeah.
Ferguson was a sundown town.
Yeah. So you have generations of families that have been uprooted, tenuously resettling in a place like East St. Louis, uprooted, tenuously settling. The city of St. Louis had just passed its segregation ordinance in 1916, restricting where African Americans could live. You have some unknown number of Black East St. Louisans desperately seeking refuge in a place like St. Louis, and they encounter. So it's this kind of reiterative. I have been somewhat involved in East St. Louis through we participated with Treasure Shields Redmond's tour, and we've been developing a Black Heritage Water Trail kind of tour up the Mississippi River. We're working with Big Muddy Adventures. We get in these 9-person canoes. You're all invited, and we reflect on the African American history of the river, including the stories of Brooklyn, Illinois, and Freedom Village, and the Mary Meacham Crossing. But also, one of the things we interpret there in that tour is how Eads Bridge should also, besides being an engineering and kind of architectural marvel, is also a site of conscience, because it is because we know that many African Americans fleeing East St. Louis were killed on that bridge, thrown over the bridge, men, women, children, into the river by white St. Louisans who came to the bridge to block the only escape path of East St. Louisans fleeing the racial massacre in 1917. So we are through that river trip commemorating that part of the Eads Bridge story that is otherwise erased. And just to finish connected back to what I was saying, the idea is that if we can commemorate this, collectively remember this, we might be, as a people, as a community, more inclined and capable of, say, advocating collectively for something like equal protection under law today. So we've been somewhat engaged there, but not to the extent I would like to be.
A question. So what do you think the path is for greater exposure and not so much, resistance and combative,
I think there's going to be an element of the society that is just intractable as that resistance is concerned, as their identity. It's like they eat, drink, sleep, contention, and they're driven by resentment politics and all that. And so I don't really envision a kind of future like rainbow world where everyone. But I do think what can be tremendously meaningful is finding ways to make it apparent that there are more of us engaged in this reparative work, including white Americans who, this was one of the things that was important about the last round of Black Lives Matter, the last wave of Black Lives Matter uprising. You had this moment, and it's sort of the windows sort of shut a little bit. I don't know if it's all the way shut yet, but you had this moment where people were talking about structural racism who had never uttered that phrase and who had been sort of allergic to the phrase before. And they'd come to a place where, people like the chancellor at WashU, this is the meeting where where I pitched joining University Studying Slavery was a meeting where he said to a bunch of senior race scholars, well, what more can we do to dismantle structural racism? Nobody remembers that language anymore. I do, because I always remind everyone too, like, this is what he said. But we need more, we need to make visible this, the diversity of the community that is recognizing that these are issues we must address collectively.
Yes.
Because it really helps to disrupt the logic of the reactionary politics, that it's us against them, and your interests are with us. So I think that can make a significant difference. But it's always in struggle. It's always these issues are always going to be contested. But I do think it's important to make these efforts visible. And honestly, I have to say, I teach a class. I teach a class called Monumental Anti-Racism, which is a first-year seminar on these issues, on the question of anti-racist memory work and what it does. And we can find it. We have a digital archive. So every cohort in the class is bringing in cases from around the world, and we put them all on a map. And we have this map that is, lit up with all these sites around the world of anti-racist commemorative interventions, or sites where there could be, that are ripe for such interventions. And I very rarely get in that class white students, particularly white males. I think one of the things that has to happen is folks reaching out through their own networks and saying, hey, this is something that is important for you to learn about. It's not, this whole, the fragility of our culture right now is just astonishing. Like, we were talking about, people saying, oh, it's political. I mean, what isn't political? Politics politics, by definition, involve the question of power. The question of power is connected to everything.
Yes.
So it is delusional to think that we can be removed from politics, or that things we are interested in have no political implications. That's different from, say, a partisan agenda or something, right? Or where you are politically campaigning for some outcome in a political race. I mean, that is, but the idea that we should avoid controversial topics is, this is a hallmark of the, I would say, with respect to the politics of race, this is a hallmark of the advanced Jim Crow, where you didn't have, you didn't need anymore the night riders and the red shirts, and you didn't need masses of perpetrators of racial terror, because the society had been so thoroughly structured to maintain white racial dominance. And so the thing to do was just be quiet, not talk about it, not acknowledge it. And there's this desperate attempt to hold on to that, that politics of decency, quote unquote, in a context of so much just tremendous indecency. And that doesn't mean we need to be uncivil, or that we need to be at each other's throats. It just means that we should question this idea that we shouldn't talk about things that might make people uncomfortable. I'm sorry, I was gonna, and then I'll come back because I know you. Yeah.
I am interested in equality of education and equalizing the academic results of K through 12 students, black or white. I say to the black audience, it's no respect that I say black. Do you prefer African American? It's shorter and easier to refer to you as black. I'm white. And if you want to call me a honky, I don't care. All right. I want to apologize to you for the treatment that my grandparents and the American ancestors before them gave to your race. I think you are all brothers and sisters. I think had God somehow entrusted you with gunpowder and longer spears, you might be the dominant powers, not the white guys. We'd be your slaves. But I don't know how that came about. But why is it that too many of my friends, let alone any of them, say reparation is not for me? I didn't do it. I wasn't here, 60 or 100 or 300 years ago. Don't look at me. I didn't do it. Why should I give my money for what my great-grandparents might have done? What's the argument to overcome that?
Yeah.
And may I say, part of the St. Louis attraction, it was for me too. I grew up here, but I've come back to face this issue. And I'm sorry I got old, and I'm sorry I lost my wife. And I don't know if it's too late to be of meaningful help to this issue, but I've come back here to try to do what you're doing, and I applaud what you're doing. Besides Dred Scott and that famous case which put St. Louis on the map, partly, this is the place of 108 Indian treaties. Every one of them was broken. Right here at Port de Sioux, it's a great place. Confluence of the Mississippi, the Illinois, the Missouri. They deserve better treatment also.
Yeah.
How can we progress this? I applaud and I'm thankful for having walked into Proud. I didn't know it existed. I didn't know what it was. But people like Nancy invited me, and I cared and was interested more than she knew or others knew. But I want to help. I'll ask you to give me help, and anything you can tonight say in the way of why we white people don't join in the apology in behalf of our ancestors. I mean, it doesn't cost us anything to say, on behalf of my grandmother, I'm sorry she called you bad names. It wasn't right, but at least I can say it wasn't right, and I'm sorry she did that.
Yeah, and I think we need to hear that more, and we the people. I mean, not just folks in this room or in the city. I think we need that example. So thank you for sharing that, and just to
It's not very far removed from the Hamas-Palestinian-Israeli conflict.
yeah, it's not.
At our universities right here in this country. That may be igniting World War III.
Yeah, it's not. There are a lot of connections, but just to go to your question about reparations, the city of St. Louis, I was testifying before the Reparations Commission last weekend, and they have this really difficult task of preparing a recommendation for the mayor. I believe in January, they're planning to release a report with recommendations for the city of St. Louis. And one of the biggest challenges will be the opposition to any kind of reparative measure.
Yes.
Now, I think the answer, one of the problems here is that a lot of the folks who are opposed to these things are not actually interested in the logic of it. It's ideological, it's emotional, it's a sort of identity kind of level thing where in many cases there's not a lot of openness to new information and a change of perspective based on that information. But
What study, what field of science?
yeah, but there is information, and there is, and just one of the
Changes that.
One of the things, I don't know what changes it. I think we need like the Men in Black wand where you just like wave it. You think you know what slavery is about? Vroom. You're like, no, tell me. But there's a book by an author named Tessa Morris Suzuki. She wrote a book called The Past Within Us, where she says, she writes that we live enmeshed in violent structures, in institutions and webs of ideas that are the product of history. And though we're not responsible for them in the sense that we cause them, we're implicated in them in the sense that they cause us. Mm-hmm. Which I think is a very powerful and accurate way of describing how the past remains present in our lives. A past we're not responsible for, but we're implicated in by virtue of what another scholar named Michael Rothberg calls structural inheritance. I talked about this in passing before. So I would say to friends who say, well, I didn't own slaves, or I wasn't even here, I wasn't born yet. I mean, I think about my, neighbors who are Chinese American, and they're thinking, what does this have to do with me? Does that have anything to do with us? They too are implicated in this past, not in the sense that they caused it, but that in the sense that it causes the conditions of their lives. It contributes, maybe the friends you talk about, or my Chinese American neighbors, aren't interested in reparations, but they're interested in a reduction in gun violence. They're interested in economic growth in our community. They're interested in other kinds of outcomes that are potentially benefited through a campaign of reparations. Now, so that's part of it. I think if people could come to a place where they acknowledge that there is enduring harm,
it seems so clear.
Separate from their implication, their own responsibility.
There was harm and is harm. And
yeah.
Why that's not clear to majority surprises me.
So it comes to us, and if we don't deal with it, it comes to the next generation and the next generation to deal with those compounding harms. And I think that's really the best we can do in terms of that argument. That it wasn't me, so don't ask me for anything.
Well, and you started off by saying you're a historical sociologist, and I think what we're all talking about is more of a historical psychologist, is I think where the problem is. So I really am troubled by Dr. Jackie bringing up East St. Louis in this context because, in a nice way, because it makes me think of this comparison. You started talking about all these things that are all these generations of racism, right? Where you have slavery develops into Jim Crow and everything. But East St. Louis was not that way. East St. Louis is a little tiny town at the end of the 19th century and had all this immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe. And they had no, they didn't have no exposure to blacks. I say this because my mother's family settled there, right? No understanding of our racist history. But in how many years, decade maybe, you're able to learn that, learn how to be racist. And it was all based on the economics there. So you have economic competition and all. And there's a mess, but anyhow. But once you do that riot, then everybody who was innocent, can we say, of that racial aspect, now all of a sudden has this guilt and the shame and the PTSD. So even not just the blacks who were the victims, but the white perpetrators, there's no way they're coming out of this going, I'm fine, right? There's a horrible, horrible trauma that they've developed. And the reason I'm saying, I'm kind of upset about Dr. Jackie saying this, because it makes me go really kind of dark, because it takes how many seconds to develop PTSD, but there's no equivalent post-wonderment syndrome, where there's something that's just so wonderful that you just go, wow, I'll carry that the rest of my life. So when you're dealing with this stuff, it's so easy to have that shame and that guilt and want to be closed in and try to protect yourself from it. But to go the other way just requires such constancy. You just have to keep working for such a long time to have any effect.
I think shame gets a bad rap, I think there is something productive about shame. And not paralyzing, debilitating shame. But shame is a way we communicate. Shame is a language we use, a feeling we use to reinforce social norms. We use it all the time with children.
I was gonna say you're a parent.
Yeah, I am.
Parents do it.
I got all kinds of tricks, and I don't believe in corporal punishment.
Oh no, but
So people do. I experienced it, but I could just give them a look, shake my head. Shame rains down, and they're like, but the point is, it's a way we communicate. In sociology and social psychology, this is called informal social control. This is, formal social control are things like the laws and regulatory bodies and the state apparatus that formally enforce rules about right and wrong. But informal social control is all the other ways we do that, like disapproving looks and sucking the teeth, all the ways we communicate that was wrong. There is disapproval of that behavior, and we intend for it to be shameful in a productive way, in a constructive way, like learning through the experience of shame. So I think there is and I'm not talking about you specifically, like you should, take a bath in the shame. I'm just saying, maybe we shouldn't be so avoidant of the feeling, and just let that feeling exist, because really, I'm ashamed of this country and much of its history, because I believe in our potential, and I know that we have not been true to our democratic proclamations and ideals, and it's shameful. it's embarrassing as an American. I'm a proud American. I don't have a bunch of flags and everything. You know, I don't wear, not wrapped in the flag all the time. But it is shameful. It is a shameful past. And I think if we could get more comfortable with that, you know, and I want to go back to the European immigrants because this is a really important, you know, really such an important point that you raised about in the case of East St. Louis. And we see this elsewhere, you know, as well. You know, marginalized European immigrants were taught that one way to become accepted by the dominant white group, to melt into the white polity, was to perform anti-blackness, anti-Asian, anti-Mexican violence. There's testimony about this, you know, people who were involved in lynchings, who were recent immigrants, European immigrants, have said that they felt that they had to be part of the mob because if they didn't, their livelihoods would be threatened. Their acceptance within the dominant group would be threatened. Groups like, you know, Irish were also racialized as inferior, and so took all these measures to melt into the sort of normal, quote unquote, white population, changing names, intermarriage. The municipal police and fire and other services were crucial in terms of becoming sort of regular Americans. There are all these books about this, by the way. There's a whole series of them, like how the Jews became white, how the Irish became white. There's one about Korean women who my friend wrote, a sociologist I went to grad school with, wrote a book about. She did a case study in ethnography in Korea where Korean women were were seeking spouses who were U.S. soldiers, but realized that, but knew, and she writes about it in the book, they knew that they really needed to link up with white GIs because white GIs, more than anyone else, would give them access to the American dream. More so than would a Black or Latino or Native American, other servicemen in Korea. So these, you know, these trade-offs are have been made by all sorts of groups. There's a book about called "The Abolition of White Democracy." That's about what the author calls the cross-class alliance among white Americans, where white elites get the white majority, who is working class and you know, poor and working class, to join in an alliance of white racial dominance, even though the white majority in that alliance doesn't actually share in the fruits to a great deal, right? There's a more recent book called "Dying of Whiteness." You gotta check this. You ever seen this book? You know, where it's about how the increased rate of premature death among white Americans, and they look at 4 Midwestern states, including Missouri, Kansas, maybe 3 or 4, how increased rates of premature death among white Americans is attributable to their support for public policies that are rooted in racial animus, support for liberal gun laws, which contribute to premature death, opposition to affordable health care, in part out of racial animus, not wanting the other to have access to publicly funded health care, and opposition to the funding of high quality public education. All of these contribute to you know, all of these undermine well-being. So there are all these alliances. You know, there's a cross-sex alliance, I would say, where white women, I mean, this has been to me astonishing in the context of the politics around reproductive rights and so forth, how we see all these ways that groups are pulled into this kind of alliance that is essential to what they see is their own path to security and opportunity at the expense of others. So it is significantly sociological, psychological, but it is also sociological in the sense that these attitudes and behaviors become structures, become institutions. There's a book called Durable Inequality, which is a bit depressing, which argues that things like the wealth gap in our society are so great and so deeply rooted in the basic structure of our society that they don't require any active maintenance anymore. They don't require the intent to maintain racial disparity in wealth. It's in the home ownership. It's in the life expectancy. It's in all of these differential outcome, much of which we inherit, like generationally is transferred. So this is really deeply concerning, but it also tells us that we need to be very intentional. If we in fact are going to address differences in wealth and related life chances, we have to be very intentional about it. It won't be enough to just stop discriminating. Like, actually need to undo the destruction of previous generations.
So since you're an import, and I don't want to keep you, but so are you familiar with Homer G. Phillips Hospital and that legacy? And that is one of those, interrupt the chain, right? That was a real boon for the African American community. And there's an excellent book, what's it called? Climbing the Ladder, Living the Dream. That's just, it should be required reading for every medical student at Washington University, period, end of discussion. They should read that.
And all the other ones.
So, but that, and that, didn't have a happy ending, if you will, but the Homer G. Phillips Nurses Association is fighting to prevent someone from using that name, Homer G. Phillips, for some little standalone little place, 6 beds, and trying to call that Homer G. Phillips Hospital, because those are well-educated, well-fought nurses who came from, and I'm a nurse, so that's why I'm like, woo, woo, woo. So, they are not letting go. They have a patent on that name, and they're not letting it go.
That's great.
It's
That's
fantastic.
great.
So but this relates to the reparations discussion in a way that I think doesn't typically isn't appreciated. So I think often when we talk about something like reparations, people think only about remedies of redistribution. There are 2 kinds of remedies related to social justice. One, remedies of redistribution live in the political economic sphere of the society, redistributing the goods of the society, like rights and resources, rewriting laws, transfers of payment, wealth, redistribution. The other kind of remedy is called remedies of recognition. And remedies of recognition deal with injustices in the cultural valuational realm of the society, the realm where we construct the meaning of things. They deal with things like erasure or disrespect, the disrespect of a culture. The story of the Homer G. Tiny Clinic is a story of, I think, there are redistributive elements to it in terms of access to healthcare and so forth, but the naming issue and the way that this developer has dug his heels in around this name.
He said, I cannot last him. Plain and simple.
Is a show of disrespect.
He has no idea what he's up against.
It's a
These
show of
women are
disrespect. But so this is so if the reparations process in our city. And unfortunately, you know, we have like 80,000 cities here in Greater Philly, 87 municipalities or something. So in the reparations process is only focused on the city of St. Louis, which is a problem given the scope of the question and its impact. But if that process was to yield in part a commitment to remedies of recognition, as well as redistribution, and in that process, this developer, McKee, was brought to the table and apologized. I should not have done this. I should have respected the wishes, the expressed wishes of the community, a community that has for so long been subject to silencing and disregard. It was wrong for me to do that, and I hereby remove all opposition. This would be many people would think of this as merely symbolic. But I would argue that it's the kind of thing that can change in a small but meaningful way the political culture, because it communicates publicly that this is a place where we are going to stop engaging in this disrespect, which not only has to do with that hospital, but how we're willing to sort of look the other way around issues like food insecurity or mass incarceration. They're all kind of interconnected. So I think I'm really glad you brought up this example because it is a really good example of where there's need for a remedy of recognition.
When you talk about disrespect, that's how I feel in terms of the whitewashing, the attempt to whitewash Black history. I feel very disrespected. And I know a lot of, and young people, because in this country, we've always been disrespected. But now you say some of our history, some of it is very sad, like the lynching and the Jim Crow. But we do have some of it, like you mentioned tonight, and I want you to tell me this book. In the 1890s, Black women who got together to save Black children.
Yeah.
I want to know that book so I can get it and read it.
I'm going to give a copy to Shelley and she'll get it to you.
Okay, thank you. Because when they started on the critical race theory thing and used that to say, well, we don't need to talk about any of this. It's making white kids feel bad. I have been close to 40 years a counselor in the St. Louis desegregation program. And pretty much every year, I've had Black kids come to me and talk about when they start discussing slavery, how ashamed they feel. And when they're reading books where they're using the N-word, and white kids say it like, smirking. And so I feel this whole whitewashing and some of the things you said, it is rooted in disrespect. And disrespect makes people sad, shame, and very angry.
And angry, yeah.
And so tonight, one thing that you said a lot that's been so helpful for me, and I'm sure all of us, but one thing you said that I'm gonna hold on to, if we would stop trying to get around discussing the truth of what has happened in the racialized violence, and that's what we do in this group. And there's another group in Ferguson called the Reading on Race. It started after the Mike Brown killing of Mike Brown, and that's a wonderful group. I haven't been able to attend it as much as I used to here lately, but that we've read all kind of books, several that you mentioned. But I think, and I want to thank you. You gave very sincere remarks. I really believe from your heart, and I want to thank you because that helps me to know there are white people who actually feel like, hey, we need to start understanding this better. And I want to thank you for that. But Geoff, the other thing is this. there are so many people, and it's not just black people, it's white people too. But I always tell black people, we can't afford to be running around here. I don't mess with politics. I'll let them take care of it. I don't want to mess with them. And I tell people, but it will mess with you. You can keep saying I don't want to mess with politics, but politics will mess with you, white, black, whatever. We got things happening to us right now because certain people have been put in positions and they're not caring about the people and doing what's best for the people. And I mean, that's local and whatever. But I'm really concerned about this whitewashing of Black history.
Yeah.
It makes me angry. It just.
Yeah, it's horrible.
What do you think is the best way for citizens and parents to handle that?
Well, I think the main thing is what you said. We have to be engaged. We have to be involved, and you know, and there are all these efforts to prevent political participation. You know,
Especially in the climate right now with
Yeah.
all the.
And you know, these electoral maps, these attempts to really hoard political power and to you know, I think you know, I'm going to come back to what I think are the best ways, but I think it's clear to me that that there's a political element in our society that realizes that it can't prevail in a fair competition. It has to use disinformation, corruption of the political process, and fear mongering and other tactics to maintain its base of support, because it can't prevail on its policy positions, particularly amidst a changing U.S. demographic and the kinds of more progressive and liberal ideas that, on average, young people have, you know, without that indoctrination and so forth, and institutionalized ignorance. So this is the whitewashing is like, you know, in part is a rehearsal of the long-standing disrespect of people of color, but it is also a reconfiguration of the attempt to control the minds of young white people. You know,
Absolutely.
which, you know, I was watching what was it? I was watching all these planes a lot recently. I was watching all these documentaries, Little Richard documentary. You know, I was thinking about this with the rock and roll concerts, and kids just wanted to dance together. They wanted to be together in these spaces and freak out. You know, you know, we got to keep them apart. We got to communicate how dangerous this is, and you know, and it's like a 21st century version of this. We've seen this before. You know, we've seen this movie before, and so I think we have to. I mean, one of the things that's happening, you know, one reason I'm hopeful is the ways we access information now in the 21st century are less vulnerable to the control that was more effective in the early half of the 20th century, where kids basically had a textbook, maybe an encyclopedia set, you know, and that was it. You know, I mean, maybe there's like, you know, a magazine here or there, but now you've got information coming to people from, you know, all kinds of ways. Film, of course, electronic, you know, digital sources, and there's corruption of those sources as well, whitewashing within them, I realize. But the ability to actually control thinking is relatively diminished today. You also have today, which is part of why you have all this effort. You have unprecedented levels of representation of women and people of color among educators at the college and university level, and other levels as well. So I think this is a real threat to our political culture, to our democratic culture. But I also think that we will find ways to carry on. I do hope, just to go back to what can we do besides being politically engaged to the extent we can, using that power to ensure that we don't have people in office who are looking to corrupt our educational systems. I think we have to be more involved in the education of our community. We can do things like your organization can host, like you're doing tonight. You can host speakers. You can host things like film screenings, book clubs, and not only to introduce, young people who are being, who are vulnerable to this issue in schools, but their parents. Let's all actually read The Bluest Eye, or one of these banned books. And this is happening. Some of these books nobody was reading, and now they're all in the bookstore windows, and people are buying them. We have this. We have this. One sort of overarching point about all of this is that this history I'm talking about has the history of colonialism, of slavery, of the other offshoots like racial violence, have profoundly distorted the moral universe. The moral universe refers to this universe to whom we have moral obligations. Who's in it? Who do we have obligations to morally, and who don't we have obligations to morally? This was the decision in the Dred Scott case, where Chief Justice said African Americans have no rights that whites are bound to respect because they're not contemplated as citizens. White supremacist ideology said this more generally about people of color not being fully human, and therefore not fully warranting consideration in terms of things like human rights. So we have to find ways to counteract that by very intentional, that corruption of the moral universe, including the rule of law and other things related to it, by being very intentional about paying respect. And I agree, your apology was a real demonstration of a simple gesture of paying respect publicly, which was profound in a society where you don't see that. You don't see that dynamic, and she really responded to that. But there are so many ways we can do that, and that our community is trying to do that. I mean, I think about, for example, historic Black cemeteries, which have historically been sites of perpetual neglect. Mm-hmm. And we can, in paying respect to those decedents, people buried in those places, we didn't do it. We didn't make the policies, structure the society in such a way that would perpetuate the neglect of those sites. But by taking the initiative to pay respect to these people because they deserve respect, we are intervening in this moral universe in a way that is, I think, meaningful. The preservation of historic sites otherwise as well. There's a quote by, I never remember the person who said it, but it's a great quote. She said, it relates to your point about the whitewashing. She said, Black histories need the same protections as Black lives because imperilment of the two is interrelated. The disrespect of the dead extends to a disrespect of the living. And so there are these things we can do to, including resisting the whitewashing of history, to be very intentional about paying respect and expressive of our intent in doing so. Like this is why we need to do this.
We have a question online
Yeah.
for you. Michael, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, thanks, Lindsay. Dr. Ward, thank you for a great program tonight.
Thank you.
So much question as I do a couple of comments, because I'm a historian and a genealogist. And as a genealogist, I tend to look at things in generations and realize and sometimes argue with people when they throw out the, oh, that was so long ago. And I bring up two things. First off, my dad grew up in Arkansas. He graduated from high school in 1957 and immediately joined the Arkansas National Guard. And so his unit was one of the units called up in September of 57 to stop the desegregation of Central High School uh, by Governor Faubus. 3.5 or 4 weeks later was when President Eisenhower federalized the National Guard and, also brought in the 101st Airborne. And so one time, I think my dad and I were watching Eyes on the Prize. And as we're watching that, and they get to the part of the documentary where they talk about for a few minutes, and then he says, we didn't have any ammunition. And to paraphrase what he said, his commanding officer told him was, we're not going to shoot white kids to protect a bunch of black kids. I started working on genealogy when I was about 16 years old. And this is another generational thing to me, because one day I was talking to my great grandma on my dad's side. Now, she was born about 10 years after the Battle of the Little Bighorn. And I'm talking to her when I'm 15, 16 years old. And we were talking about changes in the town there in Arkansas where they lived. And she was describing an area where, she'd say, oh, yeah, at one time it was all fields and marshes and stuff and lots of cattails. And then she just said, again, to paraphrase what she said, was that's where they hung that black man back in like 1936. And I said, oh, okay, so there was a lynching that happened here. And she said, yeah, and your grandpa was in, fell over, because my grandpa died when I was 10 years old. But I can remember him when we would go down there over the summer, and he was a carpenter, and he went home every day for lunch, and my grandma would always cook a ton of food, because he would go around literally the other side of the tracks in town and get a truckload of young African American kids and bring them home for lunch, and then take them back when he went back to work. And he was like, Dolly, we got to feed these kids. This might be the only decent meal they get today. And I always, when I learned of that, and first when I learned, I started doing research and asking questions down there. This was mid 70s, so I was getting phone calls and anonymous letters then telling me I needed to let this go, or, bad things could happen. But I kept up with it anyway. But after I learned about that, and then knowing my grandpa the way I knew him, I always felt like maybe that was his penance for what he did when he was young.
Yeah. Mhm. Sounds like it.
chance to, I didn't have a chance to talk to him about it.
Mhm.
But like I said, I'm thinking that was his penance, maybe.
Thank
Yeah.
you, Michael.
It sounds like it. Thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome.
It reminds me of a conversation I just had this last week or so. There's a group trying to organize in St. Louis a Black Heritage Preservation Network that will do things like organize a heritage trail and support organizations that are seeking to become registered as nationally significant places like Sumner High School, and build Black archives and that kind of thing. All these are examples of paying respect.
Mhm.
And I was in this meeting on Zoom, and one of the people in the meeting was the history. There's a new museum studies track at Sumner High School, historically Black high school in the Ville neighborhood. And the history teacher from Sumner, who leads that track, was in the class, was in the meeting. And he shared a story about how he uses genealogy with his students for them to explore, to learn about how, he has his students do genealogies with their own families so that they learn more about how they ended up in St. Louis and how they ended up at Sumner. And he said one of those kids in his class, I think this year, learned that his family moved to St. Louis some generations ago after two of his uncles were lynched in Arkansas. And he didn't know that story until he'd done that family tree work. And the reason I wanted to share that, besides the, unfortunately, there were many lynchings in Arkansas, and I'm not suggesting that this was the one that your grandfather participated in, but one of the reasons I wanted to raise that and add it to what you shared is that it goes back to this point I was making earlier about St. Louis being a refugee city. And this young man, though he didn't know the story, he carries that historical trauma with him. I imagine to some extent you do also. You carry some elements of this pain with you, and you're both here in St. Louis. Carrying the memory and to some extent the legacy of a history of a neighboring state of Arkansas. This is a complex place, and I've been astonished since being here. And I don't know what it is about St. Louis, but I've been astonished by how often people talk about St. Louis as if it's like a walled city that has a history onto its own. It's like in isolation from the rest of the world. Everything that matters here happened here. It just astonishes me considering that this is a world city. I mean, this is, in terms of the work I do, the Mississippi River, I think of the Mississippi River as America's Middle Passage. And St. Louis is the northernmost major port in this world system of transatlantic slavery that becomes especially essential in terms of the history of slavery after the African slave trade is abolished, and there is more reliance on, in terms of the slave trade, more reliance on a domestic market. Missourians, I mean, there's an amazing book I just stumbled across this book. I know I'm kind of going all over the place, but at the Missouri Historical Society archive of a slave broker from Howard County, Missouri, central Missouri, Little Dixie town, county, where he keeps detailed records of all the enslaved people he purchased and for what price and what their names were, and to whom they were sold and at what price. And he calculates on every page the totals and his profit. And but typically he's selling these enslaved folks in Louisiana through St. Louis. Some of the records we found there, which are really important to us in terms of the work we're trying to do, document the trafficking through steamboats from the port of St. Louis to ports further south on the Mississippi River. So all that's just to say, this is a place of tremendous national and even global significance that I think, the broken heart of America helped to illustrate in some painful ways. I gave a speech last year at WashU. You can find it online at this WashU and Slavery site, where I talk more about some of the WashU and slavery work. The speech was titled, "Can St. Louis Become the Beloved Heart of America?" The theme of that MLK commemoration last year was Dr. King's notion of the beloved community, a community where poverty and racism and militarism give way to mutual respect and universal goodwill. The beloved community, he often referred to this aspiration. And my argument in that speech, much like tonight, is that we have an opportunity here in St. Louis, in part because of the energy that exists here in rooms like this, and in large part because of the story we have, the history we have, not only our own local history, but all of these histories that the tributaries of the Mississippi and so forth have brought here. We have the opportunity, if we can find ways to pursue healing, to communicate to the wider world what a beloved heart looks like, how it works, how you can begin to build mutual respect and universal goodwill.
It's a beautiful vision.
I'm an optimist. It's a rose-colored, there are rose-colored lenses on when I'm saying this, but I do believe it. I sincerely believe that there is this opportunity if we seize it. And that's really what motivates a lot of my work.
There's some people in Ferguson who believe after all that has happened here, that we could possibly become a model city that went through something very terrible. We started a reading on race. This organization here was started actually, 1995? And then we came back. So I'm kind of like an optimist too, even though sometimes I get a little emotional about stuff and I have to talk to Alan. He helps bring me down. He and Becky. He and Becky kind of help bring me down. But anyway, there are people who say that we could possibly become a model city of going through something pretty terrible, and then people who really care come together and try to make this the best community ever.
Yeah. And I really think it would take greater, it would have to be more than one of our municipalities. My feeling is that all of these communities have these hard histories. I mean, we're in a battle with Valley Park right now to finally commit to reckoning with the lynching that occurred there in 1894. And I shouldn't call it a battle. It's a conversation that is unfolding slowly. And I think they may be coming to a place where they're willing to join in a commemoration of that lynching. But I think for this to be
community?
the community of Valley Park, which is southwest. Still
Mhm.
kind of figuring out the geography of this place, but, yeah,
There's a group in town called that their premise is that they want to become a compassionate city.
Right.
Mhm.
And their whole idea is just what you're talking about. Was
that's
that
great.
finding a way to overcome our differences and care about each other.
Yeah.
Because that's a national campaign that has
Yes,
certain
it is.
cities, yeah, I've been part of that too.
Yeah, Karen Armstrong started that whole thing.
I was gonna say, it's the grassroots,
That's right.
organizations like that that just keep overlapping and groups talking to one another, and yes, I do find encouragement, and I did appreciate hearing about the Sumner teacher who's coming in kind of the back doorway, maybe not having the black-white history kind of conversation, but ways to get people looking at these things, in a real way, and waking up and having some discussions. So,
Yeah.
I was gonna ask about the Washington Speaker Series, because I have gone to those a lot. Are you gonna be doing some discussions, or have you?
I don't even know what that is.
Okay, yeah. So,
Call and request him.
yeah.
They'll get him. They'll find
So
him.
they'll have talks, and I haven't been to some for a couple of years, my schedule's changed. But I've gotten on the WashU speaker series, and they'll have professors talking about important issues within the community, so.
Yeah, I haven't, I didn't know
History
about
of
it, but,
Humanities Department.
yeah,
It's, okay,
yeah, I'd be willing to do it, but I don't, I'll look into it. There's another speaker series that I was looking into for the State Historical Society of Missouri. Not for myself so much as for the Reparative Justice Coalition. I would maybe be one of the speakers, but Missouri is the only state with a statewide community remembrance project with the Equal Justice Initiative. Fitting for Missouri. I mean, Missouri, I think, should be officially known as Freedom's Compromise State. This is how we became a state. We also, I was talking to my students today, we were talking about Reconstruction, and they were surprised to learn that the compromise that ended Reconstruction happened here in St. Louis. So it's fitting that there is a statewide community remembrance project in Missouri. There's so the soil jars that are being collected through these projects with the Equal Justice Initiative, all these counties, I think there are about 8 counties right now in Missouri that are participating in this. We all collect 3 jars, one to keep locally, one to send to Kansas City to the statewide coalition exhibit that is at the Black Archives of Mid-America in Kansas City, and then one to send to Montgomery, Alabama, to the Equal Justice Initiative memorial. So there is this reparative memory work happening in our city, in greater St. Louis, I mean, and across our state. And I'm hopeful that it will add up to, if we continue to pursue it and bring more people into it and explain what it is and why it matters and all that, that it will add up to something helpful in terms of healing and creating a new kind of legacy. We're not stuck with the old legacies. We can create new legacies, which I think you all know well and you've been committed to in your work. So thank you again for.
Thank you.
Yeah, oh my gosh, this was wonderful.
Really appreciate again the invitation to finally come to Ferguson. And,
Well, I hope we get to get you back again.
yeah.
High school education in St. Louis.
Say that again?
The Little Rock 7
Yeah.
finished when they finished Central High School in Arkansas. They were 3 credits short.
Oh, and they came to St. Louis.
And they came to St. Louis.
I didn't know that.
And finished it with Beaumont High School
Huh.
on Natural Bridge.
Huh. Yeah, I didn't know that. That's interesting. We're gonna add that to the ledger on
Yes,
the other
please.
side.
So thank you all
Thank
for
you again.
coming
Thank you.
tonight, and thank you for those of you who are online and joined us. We sure enjoyed having you here, and we sure enjoyed what you had to share tonight.
appreciate it.
And I hope we do get to have you back.
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate it.